Just coming into the sense of the body, sitting here, noticing the contact with the chair or cushion. You could feel your hands or your feet. The great thing about the body is it's always here in the present moment. So, and mindfulness is something that we do need to consciously establish. So one way to establish mindfulness is to tune into the body, the felt sense of being in the body. And speaking of suffering, suffering only happens in the present moment as well, which is another reason mindfulness is key to working with it, and that the body can really support this. And you might connect with the breath if the breath works for you as an anchor in your meditation. Just that breathing in, we know we're breathing in, and breathing out, we know we're breathing out. You don't really have to follow the breath in any specific spot. It can just be a general knowing that we're breathing in and knowing that we're breathing out. And with sounds, we're aware of sounds arising and ceasing. We try to let the sound kind of rest in the background of our attention for the most part, or I find that useful. Stay anchored in the body, anchored in the knowing of each in-breath and out-breath. And if the mind wanders, as it naturally will, we don't make a big problem out of it. We just gently, with kindness, come back to the breath and the sense of the body sitting here when we can. Kind of reestablishing mindfulness in that moment. And if you're able to really stay with the breath, stay present with the body sitting here, See if you can find that subtle sense of joy that can arise. It's the joy of being here in the present moment. Again, it can be very subtle, not trying to force it, but if we kind of invite it in, welcome it, allow it, make space for that joy to arise. In a way, it's a sense of joy of being connected to what's really here in this moment. And sometimes we're too caught up in the thinking mind to really capture the joy. So that's okay too. Acceptance is key here. This is what's happening now. If the mind is pretty busy tonight, that's something we bring our mindfulness to. And then sometimes it's helpful to label the thoughts. We might be planning what's going to happen after this for us, and picking a movie in our head or something. So just call that planning. That's the label, and that might help us let it go just for now. There's nothing wrong with planning. We have to do it, but during our meditation, we try to put it aside, come back to the breath. You might check in, just notice if you're getting carried away by a story, a plan, a memory, a judgment, whatever it may be. See if you can untangle yourself from the thinking going on. Try not to be as identified as we might usually be in these stories. Take the position of the observer, observing the thoughts. Often, if we can take that position of the observer, we find that the mind quiets down a little more as well. Okay. Just curious, how did the bell sound for that? Did it sound okay? Thank you. I think I had it on the right setting. Okay, good. All right. So I think Kevin usually just launches into his talk at this point, right? We don't have announcements here. um, yeah, so like I said, the truth is I started teaching a class on Buddhism and recovery last night through the Vancouver Insight Meditation Center. It's called BCIMS. And we did check-ins and other preliminary stuff, and then we ran out of time and my talk got really shortened. I guess that was on Wednesday night. But so I thought I'd kind of give the longer version of the talk to you tonight, since I had kind of prepared it and I think it's important material. Yeah, just looking at our relationship to suffering, in recovery, because I think it's really important to keep an eye on how we continually respond to suffering, both our own and also to others around us. And this has been a time where there's probably been a lot of suffering, or just with a lot of different things that have gone on over the last year and a half. So I know just in my own life, 2 people close to me died within the last few weeks, not of COVID, but of other things. Both of them were alcoholics. One was not drinking. They just died of lung cancer because it was somebody who smoked for 60 years. And then they actually lived to be 83, which I think is somehow almost an accomplishment, to smoke for 60 years and live to 83. But I mean, nonetheless, it's sad to lose them in my life. It was a relative. And so yeah, we're going to experience suffering throughout our lives, whether we're sober or not. As the Buddha pointed out in the First Noble Truth, there is suffering, or there is dukkha. I'll talk a little bit about the definition of dukkha. I'm assuming a lot of us here have heard the word dukkha, probably. And that found this quote from Joseph Goldstein about dukkha, though, that I think is kind of interesting. He says in his book Mindfulness, he says the first challenge facing us as we read and apply these teachings is understanding what the Pali word dukkha means. In many ways, this term defines the entire spiritual path. And somehow I like that he says that, because it feels resonant to me, being somebody in recovery for the past 34 years. And it's been a lot of dukkha, even though I've been in recovery. Certainly there was a ton of dukkha before I got into recovery. But it hasn't just disappeared, and it has kind of defined my spiritual path in a way, because it's like, how have I responded to my dukkha? That's what's changed over the years. I used to respond by trying to drown it out with alcohol, or smoke it out with weed, or whatever it was, escape it at all costs. And even in early recovery, it's not like I embraced dukkha. I was still trying to get out of it. So honestly, I ate Ben and Jerry's ice cream like crazy for the first year. At one point, after literally a year, it occurred to me, I think I've had a pint of Ben and Jerry's almost every night since I got sober. I mean, so when I wasn't in rehab and couldn't get access to it, I was spending a lot of money on ice cream. So yeah, and the Buddha even talked about this, how uninstructed worldlings, people that didn't practice with him, basically, they would, their way of dealing with pain was often through sensual pleasure. That was kind of like the go-to human response to pain and suffering. And I just think that's amazing that he kind of noticed that 2,600 years ago, and that we really haven't evolved past that at all, as far as I can tell, as a species. So I just find that kind of almost reassuring that the Buddha was so dead on. Anyway, and then Joseph Goldstein goes on to say the Buddha often said that all conditioned phenomena are dukkha, and that out of his vast and limitless knowledge, he teaches only this dukkha and its end, dukkha and the end of dukkha. As an aside, because some of us have been studying the suttas, I recently found out that Bhikkhu Bodhi, of all people, says that that's a mistranslation, that the Buddha didn't say, I teach only suffering and the end of suffering, or the dukkha and the end of dukkha. He actually said, I taught, in the past, I taught dukkha and the end of dukkha, and today I teach dukkha and the end of dukkha, which I guess there's a subtle distinction where, that, in other words, that's not the only thing he teaches, but he's been teaching that consistently along with many other things. So just kind of interesting, because I've heard that quoted by every Buddhist teacher, including Joseph Goldstein in this article or in this book. Anyway, so then Joseph goes on to say, the problem is that there's no single word in English that fully captures the range of the meaning of dukkha. Most commonly, it's translated as suffering, and although in some contexts this translation works well, it's not a perfect fit. In one teaching, the Buddha said, whatever is felt is included in dukkha, but as we know, some feelings are pleasant and enjoyable. We don't feel them as suffering. And what the Buddha meant there was that even if it's pleasurable, it's impermanent and it's not self. So it's going to eventually cease. We're not going to, and also we can't control it because we're not really in charge of it. It's not us. So that's why he said everything is dukkha. But anyway, that can be a kind of a subtle distinction. Joseph goes on to say, we might get a better sense of its meaning by remembering its etymological derivation. The word is made up of the prefix du, and the root kha, I guess ka. And the du means bad or difficult. And the ka part means empty. And empty here refers to several things, some specific, some more general. But one of the specific meanings was referring to an empty axle hole of a wheel. So they usually use like ox carts back then. You may have seen pictures of, they still have ox carts in India because I saw some. And the dukkha was if the axle fits badly into this axle hole, then we get a very bumpy ride on our ox cart. So it's kind of like pointing to the fact that life is a bumpy ride. It's kind of my translation of it. And I just find that interesting. So, like, I don't know about you, but I would go out and get drunk over all kinds of big or little dukkhas in my life, It didn't have to be that bad for me to use it as an excuse to go out and get loaded. And sometimes it was a happy thing that you would use to go out and get loaded too. So I don't know, but it seems like it all points back to dukkha on one level or another. And I guess the best thing I've gotten out of my Buddhist practice is this ability to work with whatever's happening in my life in a more conscious way without needing necessarily to find the escape hatch, of sensual pleasure that the Buddha talked about, whether it's using or ice cream or, TV or video games. On the other hand, I still do a lot of that stuff all the time. So it's tricky. But here's a a quote from Philip Moffat, the book Dancing with Life, which was really a modern version talking about the Four Noble Truths. And it's a pretty good book. He says the path to happiness and a sense of well-being in this very life lies not in avoiding suffering, but in using the conscious, embodied, direct experience of it as a vehicle to gain deep insight into the true nature of life and your own existence. Which is kind of a long sentence, but I think it's pretty good. And I heard Ajahn Pasano, he's a Thai forest monk, speak last night, and he said that his teacher, Ajahn Shah in Thailand, would always say, everything is teaching us. Everything is teaching us. And certainly I didn't used to see that way. If something didn't go well in my life, I didn't usually say, oh great, I'm going to learn something. It was usually more like, this sucks, which was my go-to phrase in life for many years, I'm afraid to say. I even got in trouble for saying that in 6th grade and had to take a note home to my mom because I said it to the teacher when she gave us some math homework over the weekend. We had like this weekend, we had a long weekend, and she gave us this really hard math homework, and I said, this sucks. And then I got in trouble. So everything is teaching us, and that has been a kind of a mantra for me as well over the years, although it's one of those that it's so easy to forget. One story I like to tell, because it really impacted my practice, was I went to Burma to study with my teacher, one of my favorite teachers, Sayadaw U Tejaniya. You may have heard of him. He's really interesting monk who talks about continuous awareness throughout our day, that we're not just trying to be aware on the cushion or for an hour every morning, but throughout the day, all the time. And he had, before he became a monk, he worked for his family. They had a men's shirt business in Yangon. And so he would be in the little storefront selling shirts, but whenever there wasn't somebody in the shop, he would be practicing like very consciously. And he said that his practice took off when he really started doing that. So I find him very inspiring. And I went all the way to Burma to see his monastery, and I stayed there for 2 weeks a few years ago. And before all the stuff that's happening now there, Myanmar, Burma. And but anyway, everywhere we went, they had these bumper stickers, which I thought was interesting. Be mindful. And he had a big stack of them on his desk, and I said, Sayadaw, can I please have some bumper stickers? So he said, sure. And I took like a bunch of them. I wish I could hand them out. But anyway, so really you were just supposed to be mindful of whatever was happening at any given moment. That was your whole job at the monastery. And at one point, and we would meet with the teacher every few days, and there were different groups. There were people from all over the world at this monastery. There were like 250 people there, and they were just people from so many different countries, which was really cool. And so he would have different groups for different language groups. And so the English group hadn't met with them for quite a while. Like it had been he kind of disappeared sometimes from the monastery. And I had to leave soon, like had a flight out coming up, and I was really wanting to see him again. And I realized it was kind of spending too much time suffering over this. And I went back to the room I was staying in, and I just was like kind of churning and suffering a little. And then I literally saw this bumper sticker on the door of my room, right? And it occurred to me, be mindful. Oh yeah, we're supposed to be mindful of everything, even the painful stuff. And I was like, oh, so I'm supposed to be mindful of how much I'm suffering right now over wanting to see the teacher and not knowing if I'm going to get to before I have to leave and all that. I came all this way, yada, yada. We're good at coming up with these stories that we can suffer over. But it really was amazing because I then sort of did what Philip Moffat was suggesting, which is I kind of used it to inquire and make a conscious investigation of this whole suffering that I was going through. And it was a process, but I don't know how long. I just was like kind of meditating on my bed, thinking through, but in a inquiring kind of way. And then I worked through it and I realized, this has been a great time at the monastery, whether I see him again or not. I don't need to be suffering over this. I'll see him again. If I don't see him, I've already gotten great teachings. I've met friends from all over the world now. It was like it was also a bit of a gratitude check, like all the positive things that had happened. And after a while, the suffering had dissipated and I felt much, much better. And it really felt like, oh, this is what the practice is all about. It's really, suffering and the end of suffering. But it's so easy to miss that for some reason. But it really helped me get through that. I mean, this is not the most terrible type of suffering we can have, I realize, but it just was a good practice moment for me. Understanding sometimes it's easier to practice on something that's a little less high stakes than, dealing with cancer or something. But anyway, then I got up and I walked out of the building I was in, and here comes the teacher back onto the monastery grounds. He had been away for a few days. He arrived back, and sure enough, I got to meet with him like the next day, and it all worked out. But the funny thing was, somebody else in the English group, as soon as they saw him, that person went up and started giving him grief that he needed to meet with the English group right away because it had been too long. She was kind of caught in her suffering. So anyway, I was there, but for the grace of Buddha, go I was able to realize. But yeah, nothing but compassion for that person. I was there. And then the other thing that I have been moved by is, do you know who Gabor Mate is? Gabor, the guy. He's a medical doctor from Vancouver. And he wrote the book In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts about working with addicts in Vancouver. And, the way he talks about addiction is very compassionate. And he talks about how he says, this is from a YouTube video, but I transcribed some of it. He talks about how addiction is not a choice that anybody makes. And it's not a moral failure. It's not an ethical lapse. It's not a weakness of character. It's not a failure of will, which is how our society depicts addiction, nor is it an inherited brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it. And then he says, but it's a response to human suffering. And all these people that I worked with in Vancouver, he says, had been severely traumatized usually as children. And so then he skip a little bit, but he goes on to say, addiction then is actually, rather than being a disease as such or a human choice, it's an attempt to escape suffering temporarily. And then you get caught in that cycle. And whether this is a globally true thing, I guess could probably be debated. But certainly it's true enough for me and for many people that I've gotten to know in recovery. And I don't know if you've ever watched that show that they air on TV called Intervention. You ever seen that show? But if you look at that show, every single person that they follow in that show, it almost always goes back to that. Like you find out during the course of the show that their parents had some traumatic divorce when they were 2 years old or whatever. Like it almost always ends up they reveal something like that. So I just find it interesting. Doing my own little study by watching Intervention. Um, but I think the other part of that is that we, in recovery, we have to come to terms with whatever that was for us, uh, that led to our addiction of choice, that is part of our journey in recovery as well. If we really want to heal, and Gabor Mate talks about this later in that talk. But I like, he says that, we often ask the wrong questions, like the medical community, when they're dealing with people who are suffering from addiction. He says that we might ask, what did they do for you, either the drugs or the behavior that led to your addiction? And also, how come you're in so much emotional pain? And so, and he goes on, he says, so it's never a question of anybody curing anybody else, but we can guide people to healing if we ask the right questions. What are you carrying inside that's making you behave that way? And how can we help you resolve that, And that's what healing is. And that happens inside each person. So that's, the healing is kind of our own journey, but I know I take help wherever I can get it, but it's really about healing that pain that led to our addiction. And I do think that what often can lead to relapse is when we aren't willing to look at that sort of original pain that got us here in the first place, even over time. And I only say that because one of my closest friends, I think that's what happened to him in recent years, and he just died of alcoholism a few weeks ago. He couldn't ever get back, like he'd been sober for 20 years. He relapsed, drank for quite a few, like 5 or 6 years, went to rehab several times, never really got back fully into recovery, for whatever reason, and ended up dying of cirrhosis of the liver and diabetes as a direct result of his alcohol consumption, of a lot of alcohol, like drinking a lot of tequila. So yeah, so there's that. But I mean, the good news is that it's possible and that this practice, the mindfulness practice, really can support us, and this community, having a sense of community where we can support each other in this healing process, is all really helpful and good. And so just the fact that we're here tonight is promising for all of us, I would say. And let's see. And we do have to stay motivated on the path of recovery, because some days are harder than others. And I love the one thing, I do, there's lots of great quotes from the AA 12-step literature. One is, what we really have is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. And meditation, that is so helpful for my spiritual condition. I do meditate every day, and I have since 2005, and it's changed my life. And I was sober for 17 years before that. And I was talking to somebody about this earlier, this is like a different stage of my recovery, the before meditating every day and the after. And it's really is vastly different today in terms of how much I suffer over things. And it doesn't mean I don't suffer at all, but it's just so much reduced. And one way I know that is I have journals, because I always wanted to be a writer. So I have all these journals from all those miserable 17 years, right? And there were plenty of positive things that happened during those 17 years. But if you read my journals, I was suffering more than anything else. It was all like finding, I don't know what, but it just was not like writing about how great everything was. It was suffering over this relationship or this job, this boss, this whatever. And something really shifted where after I went on a couple of retreats and really got into a pretty serious meditation practice, I couldn't really even write in these journals anymore. Like I could take notes if I heard a good lecture or something, but in terms of writing down my personal suffering, it just didn't happen anymore. And that was really eye-opening to me, that like it just naturally fell away. Like I just couldn't. So I think that the journaling probably supported me in some ways. It wasn't all bad by any means, but the practice kind of took off and I didn't need that anymore. And the suffering seems to have really reduced. And there's the two arrows. So there's the first arrow is the suffering that we can't avoid, the arrow that we're going to get hit by some arrows in life, like that is part of life, built into being in this incarnation. We're going to have the aging process. We're going to have people we care about are going to also age and get sick and die around us. Everything's going to be impermanent. So even when things are good, it's not going to last. If we have kids and they are bringing great joy to our lives, but then they grow up and become teenagers or whatever, and that changes. So, they might be great teenagers, but then they eventually go away, off on their own, and we don't see them that much anymore, whatever it is. So, there is the first arrow that we can't avoid. But then the second arrow is the one that we actually pull out and shoot ourselves in the foot or whatever over the first arrow. It's our response or our reactivity to the first arrow. That's the second arrow. And that arrow can be avoided, is the teaching here. And I just find that useful because I used to be such a master at shooting that second arrow right into my own heart or whatever, and just doubling down on the pain without meaning to. It wasn't my intention to make it worse. But there are ways that we can learn how to stop doing that. There's so many quotes about this. Deepa Ma, one of my favorite teachers, she was a Bengali woman in India that Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and these different teachers, they all met her and were very inspired by her. She said, human beings will never solve all their problems. The only way is to bring mindfulness to whatever you are suffering from. And if you can manage only 5 minutes of meditation a day, you should do that. But just pointing to the same thing. And I just got this book called Dopamine Nation. And it's Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence by Anna Lemke, MD. It's a doctor at Stanford Medical Center or something. And she works for the Stanford Addiction. She's the medical director of Stanford Addiction Medicine. And anyway, and sure enough, right here, she talks about mindfulness. And she says, the trick is to stop running away from painful emotions and instead allow ourselves to tolerate them. When we're able to do this, our experience takes on a new and unexpectedly rich texture. The pain is still there, but somehow transformed, seeming to encompass a vast landscape of communal suffering, rather than being wholly our own. I think that's a really beautiful way to look at it, that in a way that our suffering is what connects us all. And certainly we're all here due to a sort of shared sense of suffering on some level, that we all have suffered over some form of addiction, I assume, or something in that realm. And so that when we really tune into it, it's not all, it can be like she says, some used in a very beautiful way, and it can add uh, rich texture to our lives, which sort of reminds me of the blues, the music. It's like, which are one of my favorite types of music is the blues, and that's coming out of suffering. Richly textured music coming out of suffering. So, yeah, maybe that's a good quote to end on, and then to open it up to you all. I'd love to hear what's on your minds with the time we have left, or if you have any questions or comments. I'm love to hear what's happening for you. Anybody want to? I have many more notes, but I kind of feel like that's a good note to end on. Oh, and there's some information about Dana, D-A-N-A, in the chat. But yeah, any questions about any of that? Or I'm sure it's pretty familiar territory for us all, but or comments. Or feel free to disagree.
Julia's got a hand up. Go ahead,
Oh.
Julia.
Thank you for sharing. I don't know if I have any questions. I had a week with a lot of anxiety, and I get this anxiety of public speaking, not in AA meetings. I used to back in the day, but mainly in a work setting in front of a bunch of colleagues. And it just kind of overcomes me, and I become very unintelligent, like I just blank out. And I got a lot out of your talk this evening about dukkha and, kind of that thing of accepting life on life's terms and, just embracing what is rather than running from it and having I just sobered up again. And, it was cookies for a while and things like that, and caffeine. And I don't know, it's just good to just kind of be alive and breathing and meditating again, with a sober mind rather than being hungover and trying to meditate. And those books that you mentioned, there was two that I had not heard of, and then I've just recently heard of Lemke. She's been on a lot of talk shows lately, the one that wrote Dopamine. It's really interesting talks. And so thank you. I'd like to hear what everyone else says, but I appreciate you coming, and I got a lot out of it. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I was terrified of public speaking for a long time. So it's like, honestly, it's a bit of a miracle that I can do this at all. So that tells me also there's been some progress on the path here. Thank you. Go ahead, Sasha, when you're done. Caught you in mid-sip.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Walt. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that today's gathering was just awesome. So it was really good to hear about suffering in respect to alcoholism. I've been in recovery for a long time, and I think it's like I'm at that point now where, like I've just discovered Buddhist perspectives on 12-step recovery, and it's blown me away. And it's really, I feel like it's deepening and enriching my experience of recovery in a way I didn't know existed. So it was really good to hear about dukkha. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
Hi, Walt. It's Angela.
Hey, Angela.
Thank you so much for this class. Yeah, very helpful stuff. More books that I want to read at some point in my life. I just pulled a book off my shelf this morning that's been waiting for me to read it. Ajahn Chah's Impermanence and the End of Suffering, it said, and I like the impermanence piece sort of resonated with me just, yeah, noticing that things come to an end, feelings and yeah, stuff that I so identify with in the moment, so yeah, some really good reminders. And I love the be mindful bumper sticker. I might ask you to send me a photo of that, because I've been living at home with my mom, and I used to jokingly say, don't spaz out. And it was sort of her, I think she said that herself, but then I was like, that's sort of, that's not very nice to say. I've been trying to be more mindful of my speech. Right. And so then I started saying, be mindful, like for me too, right? Like I know when I'm around the house doing things and I'm not being mindful, it's just like I've dropped something or, but now, like anything, she says it sometimes with like a meanness, I wasn't being mindful. And I'm like, no, it's not a way to like criticize ourselves, because that's what I do. It's just another way, just like with AA, it's just another way I can criticize. But I loved how you also brought in compassion in that example, like nothing but compassion, because you were there. Like that was so beautiful how you said that. And that is also what like being in recovery has helped me to have compassion, because I've been a lot of places that, yeah, anyway, I'm glad to not be anymore. But so I guess I do have a question after all of that. I just was curious if you could sort of go back through. I know you touched on it briefly, or maybe just say, like, repeat what you said. Like, I feel like it's just a nice reminder. I mean, I almost got like a tinge of sort of what I've been doing in the moment, if I am able to remember, right? Like that's always the key, but like, it just felt like you were just giving yourself compassion in that moment of like, oh yeah, like recognizing, what was happening. And then just saying, like you said, brought in gratitude. So I don't know if you could I just feel like that was really an important thing for me to take away from, tonight, especially just that, yeah, process that you went through in that moment, which I totally could relate to as well. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I think you captured it pretty well. I mean, it's just that process of noticing, either I am really suffering or there's a lot of suffering going on here in this kind of mind, heart, body, and just taking that moment to really tune into that. Because often it's happening and we kind of try to walk away from it, ignore it, watch TV. We don't sit with it and take it in. But then also we really want to take it in with, like you said, with kindness and compassion for ourselves. Like, oh, wow, there's some suffering going on here. And I mean, that is not what I used to do. This definitely has been a learned practice over years. And that's why, the metta practice can be helpful to kind of till the soil where we might be able to actually do this authentically. And then gratitude too is another practice that I've been cultivating over the past many years, because we're so good at negative thinking. I know I was a master. I mean, I had bad nicknames you don't want based on my ability to shoot a hole in anybody's plan, like negative. Anyway, don't need it. But so I consciously tried to counter that with gratitude practice and things like that. And that's actually helped. So in other words, instead of sitting down and noticing everything wrong with the situation, sitting down and noticing what's great about it. Like, isn't it great that Kevin has this community that he's been offering these regular teachings for so long that gives us all this forum, and just thinking all these. So in that moment at the monastery, I just was like remembering, isn't it great that I actually made it here all the way to Myanmar, Burma from California, like not a small thing by myself, whatever, and that so many things could have gone wrong just getting there. Like I went to Bangkok with no paperwork to get to the monastery in but I just trusted that through various means, I was going to be able to get in touch with somebody in Singapore who was going to contact somebody in Bangkok to meet me with the paper I needed to take to the Myanmar embassy or whatever. Like, and it all worked out. But man, I could have flown all the way over there and still not been able to do what I need. So I was, there's usually a lot of gratitude we can bring in if we remember to do it. And the last thing to say is the word for mindfulness in Pali, like dukkha is for suffering. The word for mindfulness is sati, S-A-T-I, and it's really about memory. The root of it, it is about remembering. And because the toughest thing about mindfulness is remembering to be mindful, which you pointed to. And like you said, it's really important not to beat ourselves up when we realize, oh, I've been completely mindless for the past few hours. But it's just so good to be grateful when we do remember to be mindful and to cultivate it in that way. And it does build momentum over time with practice. And it does eventually become fairly automatic for many people, like I've heard. Sometimes for me, not always. But then if that's why the bumper sticker is good, because it can trigger the memory. So yeah, I might be able to mail you a bumper sticker if you. All right, well, I know we're over time, so we should probably end, but thanks for the questions and comments, and great to see everybody. And see you again soon, hopefully.